So we usually begin our talks at 12:10 on what we call Berkeley time. So I've got maybe 30 seconds more for people to find their places.
Hello. Hi, everyone. As we're getting ready, community members, certainly students, know that we start at Berkeley time at 10 after. Before we get going, I wanted to note a couple of housekeeping items for our class. One, students, we're about to send the list of our enrolled student body to Cal Performances and the theater department, who will be providing you with free tickets. And I'm going to be asking anyone who is not enrolled but might still be on our list or intends not to take the class to verify whether they are continuing or not. We're sort of at that make or break moment. Okay, so we'll be asking for that clarity so that we can get you into Cal Performances. Our very first performance will be with Reggie Wilson coming up soon. Also, I'll also note that in addition to this ongoing lecture every Wednesday at noon, starting next Monday, we will launch our Monday evening public lecture around the themes of public reassembly, where reassembly has a range of resonances across the arts, across democracy and politics, and also helps us think about new technologies. And so we'll be launching the series on Monday. Students, if you look into your pages section in your B course, online B course arrangement, you'll see that this lecture series is also a recommended activity in that list, and we hope to see you there. For students and community members, many of these lectures are also very relevant for this theme of curation across disciplines. Finally, those, whether you're on the Arts and Design mailing list or want to be on it, we have a sign-up here and little cards passed out on your way in to make sure that we can keep you informed of upcoming exciting activities all around the campus. All right, so with that, I'll introduce the person who will introduce our next exciting lecturer, Natasha.
Thank you, Shannon. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the third week of Thinking Through Arts and Design at Berkeley. Our theme this semester is curation across disciplines, and we're looking at, over our semester, the visual arts, performance, and science, and then also thinking about sort of cross and transdisciplinary mashup experiences. And it's a very experiential class based on the students have access to all the various arts venues on campus and around the Bay Area. This is thus a campus-facing course on Mondays, closed to the students, and a public-facing course today with a mixture of Berkeley Art Museum, Pacific Film Archives guests, and students. So we're happy to greet all of you, and thank you so much for coming today. The course is co-taught with my colleague, Eric Siegel, who's the director of the Berkeley Botanical Gardens. Do you want to just wave your hand? Who's just arrived here in our community, so we welcome him, as well as Shannon Jackson, who just spoke with you on some housekeeping details. And Shannon Jackson is the Associate Vice Chancellor for this Arts and Design at Berkeley initiative. In week 3, we're really thinking about visual arts curated experiences. Last week, the students I spoke on Baya, a woman of Algiers, so it was a painting-based lecture. And this week, we are very delighted to introduce to all of you Apsara DiQuinzio, who is going to speak on an exhibition that's right in the other room, which is always wonderful to drift from it into here and then back into the gallery after the lecture, so that Charles Howard, A Margin of Chaos. And Apsara DiQuinzio is both a friend and colleague of mine and a very important member of our ecosystem here, our arts ecosystem in the Bay Area. She is both the curator of modern and contemporary art at the BAMPFA at Berkeley Art Museum Pacific Film Archives, which we always have to say, I've been told, and works with and under the director and chief curator, Larry Rinder here, along with the rest. We've been talking to the students about how museums are structured, along with the other curators here at the institution. Apsara also has the hat of the Phyllis C. Wattis Matrix Curator. And the Matrix program is an extremely interesting program that is celebrating its 30th anniversary, and I was going to ask Apsara what we're doing for that, but we can address that later. So it's been in the Bay Area. It's called the Matrix Program for Contemporary Art, and it features Bay Area, introduces the Bay Area community to exceptional work being made internationally, nationally, and locally, and was endowed by the great Phyllis C. Wattis. So during Apsara's 5-year tenure, this is during the 5th year, she has organized numerous exhibitions, including the one she'll be speaking to us about today, and other solo exhibitions and by such artists as Nicole Eisenman, John Zurier, Tarek Atui, and many others, Michael Armitage recently as well, and many others. Previously, Apsara worked at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, where she organized a fantastic exhibition called 6 Lines of Flight, Shifting Geographies in Contemporary Art, as well as The Air We Breathe, Artists and Poets Reflect on Marriage Equality. In addition to these exhibitions, she's also worked at SF MoMA with Trisha Donnelly and Vincent Fecteau and other Bay Area artists. Prior to SF MoMA, DiQuinzio worked at the Whitney Museum of American Art, where she co-organized the 2004 Whitney Biennial. I think that's with Larry, right? No? Who was? Oh, well, who was it with in 2004? Right. Okay, Deborah Singer, Chrissy Isles, and Shameen Millman. And she has contributed to many exhibition catalogs and journals, including Art Forum, Moose, Cura, and The Exhibitionist, which I introduced to the students last week on Monday, the Exhibitionist series. So delighted to have the museum's in-house curator here with us today. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for coming. And thank you, Natasha, for that introduction, and thanks to Eric and Shannon and Natasha for inviting me to speak here today on Charles Howard, A Margin of Chaos. If I stand here, can you still hear me? Let's see. Okay. Which I hope you all have had a chance to see. It's on view in our lower level galleries, as Natasha mentioned. So this is the first survey exhibition of Charles Howard's work since 1956, and that last exhibition took place at the Whitechapel Gallery in London. And in the U.S., it's his first survey at an institution since 1946, and that last one took place at the Legion of Honor. So I think it's safe to say Howard's work is largely unknown to contemporary artists or audiences, and that includes even scholars of American art. And so in developing this exhibition, I was really embarking on a kind of historical excavation of this artist's work. So in this lecture, I'm going to take you through a bit of process in organizing the exhibition, and then also we're going to discuss Howard's work itself in greater detail. So Howard had a very long and distinguished career that spanned 5 decades. He was included in a number of momentous exhibitions throughout his career, including Julian Livi's seminal 1932 exhibition Surrealism, which first introduced New York audiences to Surrealism. He was also included in the International Surrealist Exhibition in 1936 in London, and was one of 3 American artists in both of those exhibitions. He was also included in Peggy Guggenheim's seminal Art of the Century exhibition, which you see a picture of here on the screen, and that was in 1942. In addition to having shown in numerous important, significant museum exhibitions throughout the 40s. So it is a bit perplexing as to how he is so unknown to contemporary audiences. And so that was a kind of historical conundrum that intrigued me. And that I sought to explore a little bit in this exhibition. So this exhibition, the aim of this exhibition was really to bring greater renewed historical focus to this great artist. And I think that this image that you're looking at right now sort of emblematizes this historical conundrum. So this is the Abstract and Surrealist Gallery of Peggy Guggenheim's Art of the Century. And in the foreground, you can see a painting by the well-known artist Kandinsky. And then you can also see works by Naum Gabo, Antoine Pevner, Amédée Ozenfant. These are all artists that are well-known to modernists. And then in the back, just next to the Calder mobile, you see a painting that's sort of tilted downward. And that is Charles Howard's painting. So I think this is emblematic in that his work gets somewhat eclipsed by more well-known artists that he tended to show with. And so in this photo, he sort of remains beyond our perceptual field. And so really, like I said, the aim was to bring his work back into our perceptual field of recognition. This is the first painting I came to know by Charles Howard. It's called Banner from 1934. And it's in SF MoMA's collection where I used to work, as Natasha mentioned. And it was during a project that I did with the contemporary artist who lives in San Francisco, Vincent Fecteau, in 2009, that I became acquainted with this painting. And this exhibition, which was called Not New Work, Vincent Fecteau Selects from the collection. Here's an installation view of it here. The artist mined hundreds of objects in SF MoMA's collection of works that had rarely, if ever, been on display in the museum. So this exhibition, too, was a kind of historical excavation. And Fecteau himself has a deep interest in narratives that often go untold, but are, of course, present nonetheless. So that is how, and then I also, during this exhibition, I also became acquainted with the estate, which was, of course, very important. So before I start launching into a discussion of Howard, I thought I would talk a little bit about process. So in developing the exhibition, first of all, it really takes about 2 to 3 years to develop an exhibition of this scale and scope. And I would say that conversations began between myself and the director 5 years ago. So this was really a long exhibition in the making. And so in order to begin thinking about doing an exhibition like this, you have to do a lot of preliminary research. And so that first phase of producing an exhibition I'm sort of referring to as the preliminary research phase. And that involves culling existing work by Howard into a database. I often like to begin research on exhibitions by just learning everything that exists by the artist. And so that often involves looking at all printed matter, publications, doing searches through auction houses, contacting galleries that have sold previous work in the past, and really sort of compiling everything that is known to exist about this artist. And that also includes searching in all relevant museum collections. And this, of course, has gotten easier to do in recent years because most museums have put their collections online, and so they're searchable. And then, very importantly, you want to contact the artist's estate, and hopefully they will give you their blessing to proceed with the exhibition. And I was very fortunate in that they were willing and enthusiastic and were great partners in developing this exhibition. And then they had a lot of material that was sort of unknown as well. And then another thing you want to do is to see as much work in person as possible. And this can be somewhat difficult depending on your budget. I didn't have an enormous budget, so you really have to prioritize those works that you're going to see. And so in this case, I went to the Menil collection in Houston, which has a large amount of Howard's work. And then I visited all the New York institutions such as the Guggenheim, the Whitney, the Met, and spoke to curators there and saw the works in person, and then, of course, all of the local museums, as well as the Blanton in Texas. So I did as much as I could on that front. And then you, in addition to visiting those museums, you want to visit all of the pertinent archives, such as the Smithsonian Archives of American Art. And in my case, I went to the Whitechapel Gallery and spent a day in their archives researching, since Charles Howard's last survey was at the Whitechapel in London. And then you have to begin becoming a scholar, essentially, of the artist, and reading all existing material on the work. And unfortunately, in this case, there wasn't that much. And then you really enter the production phase. And that entails beginning to produce the catalog, which involves identifying a publisher, and then inviting authors to write essays for the catalog, and then writing essays, and then again culling a very large amount of photographs. And in many cases that means taking new photographs, because a lot of the work didn't have digital photographs. A lot of the paintings didn't have digital photographs. So we had to hire photographers to go and shoot those works. And then you have to fundraise for the exhibition, which can be a bit of a nail-biting experience. We were very fortunate in this case that we secured a very generous grant from the Terra Foundation of American Art, and that really enabled us to proceed with this exhibition. And then you have the very difficult task of finalizing the checklist and determining what works you think are crucial for the exhibition, and what works will really help you to tell the story of this artist. And so out of the large database, you probably reduce that. I think there's about 80 works in the exhibition now, so from a much larger list, you have to be selective. And then you have to send out all the loan forms. And this can be a very complicated, laborious process in that you have to, if you're wanting to borrow a work that's in a museum collection, you have to send out a loan request at least a year in advance in order to secure that work for the exhibition. So there is a lot of administrative preparatory work that goes along with that. And then the fun part sort of develops, which is planning the installation and meeting with the museum staff and determining the wall color, the galleries that the exhibition will be in, and determining the layout for the exhibition, which is again very important because that's how viewers will experience this artist's work, and it's a way to tell the story. And then you also have to determine the condition and framing needs. And because a lot of this work had not been seen in so long, there were certain instances where we had to hire conservators to work on the condition, and then make sure that everything was framed, and this can also be an interesting process. Many of the frames did not match in this exhibition, and so a lot of things had to be reframed so that the frames wouldn't be too distracting in the process. So that's just a little kind of overview of the process, and now I'm going to launch into more about Charles Howard. So the Howard family was a family of artists and architects, and John Galen Howard was hired by Phoebe Apperson Hearst and President Benjamin Ida Wheeler to become the supervising architect of UC Berkeley's campus in 1901. So in 1902, the family moved from Montclair, New Jersey to Berkeley. And this is a picture of them, which is courtesy of the artist's estate. And this shows the family in the Berkeley Hills on Thanksgiving Day in 1902. And Charles Howard is the youngest, or actually not the youngest, but he's in the front of the picture with the bow in his hair. So all of the Howard clan were artists and architects. Howard had 4 siblings, 3 brothers and 1 sister, and each of them would become an artist or architect. Henry Temple Howard would become an architect. Robert Boardman Howard would become a sculptor. John Langley Howard would become a painter, whose work is visible in the Coit Tower, as is Robert and Henry. And then Jeanette Howard, who would study architecture as well. The parents, of course, were artists as well. So Mary Robert Howard, Bradbury Howard, was a painter and a pianist. And on the left here, you see a lovely watercolor that she made. And on the right, you see one of John Galen Howard's buildings on campus. So he was supervising architect from, as I said, 1901 until 1924. And during that time, he created many of the campus's most well-known buildings, including the Greek Theater, Sather Tower, which you see here, Bolt Hall, and the Hearst Memorial Mining Building, Sather Gate, et cetera, et cetera. So, and he studied in the neoclassical tradition at the Beaux-Arts School in Paris. And I should say all of the Howards were Francophiles. This is a picture of Howard, most likely when he was graduating from high school. So Charles went to Berkeley High School and then also to UC Berkeley and studied journalism. He graduated in 1921, believing that he would then become a writer. So at that time, he was the only one in the family who was not going to become an artist or architect. And then After briefly pursuing graduate studies at Columbia and Harvard, he embarked on a 3-year journey throughout Europe, which would be a really pivotal experience for him. And in the summer of 1923, he went to the town of Castelfranco, which is just outside of Venice. And he visited this altarpiece by the artist Giorgione. And it was he writes much later that it was this experience of seeing this altarpiece that made him really want to become an artist. And I thought I would read a small section of what he wrote about that experience. And he wrote about this later in an essay called What Concerns Me, which is also reproduced in the catalog. So he says, I looked at the picture for a quarter of an hour. I looked at nothing else. It may be that I thought of all the other pictures I had been looking at in Italy when I had been spending time in galleries that should by all rights have been spent on something else, writing a novel, say. It may be that I ruminated on the somber, analytical, philosophical approach of the Florentine painters, and then on the free, warm, romantic fervor of Venice. I think it is fairly certain that I realized even in those few minutes that here, in this picture before me, was a combination of both these approaches, that here, for once, was a synthesis. So we don't have too much to go on in terms of what Howard's subject matter was, but that passage, I think, is really key, because he is writing it much later. And in fact, we do know through letters that exist in the Bancroft, it's another place you have to go to, that he had written to his father earlier in 1922 or 23, saying that he had started experimenting with watercolors, and that he was enjoying just trying to make compositions in watercolors. And he said at that point, here's another artist, Pop. So we do know he had started thinking about it a little bit before then, but I think it's interesting how these things get romanticized perhaps a little bit later as well. So in this painting, as he said, you see a synthesis of Florentine and Venetian styles. And I think this is an important painting to remember throughout the rest of his oeuvre, because in it you see several important things. One is the palette, the use of green and red. So you'll see much later in several compositions that he uses this similar kind of forest or emerald green, and he puts it in the center of his compositions pretty consistently. As with red, the color red, you see a really saturated, beautiful red that appears in the center of his compositions as well. So he's taking certain elements of this and then repeating them throughout his career. Also, you see the flag that St. Nicasius is holding. And in much of his later work, you'll see these curious flags and pennants that pop up in his paintings. And then another aspect that I want you to keep in mind is this sort of tension between interior space and exterior space. So this is the genre of the Sacra Conversazione in Italian Renaissance painting, and of course Giorgione was a master of Italian Renaissance from Venice and was known for his very mysterious compositions and subjects. And so you see here this intimate space that is the Madonna and Child, and then this sort of exterior space, almost as if it's a window or an aperture that gives you a view off into the distance and the location. And you'll see that again and again in Howard's paintings, this tension between interiority and exteriority. So in 1925, Howard, well, as soon as he writes that as soon as he had that experience, he moved back to Paris and began working and painting. And then later, in 1925, he moved to New York and settled in Greenwich Village and began working in the firm of Louise Boucher and Rudolph Gertler, and it was a decorating firm. And Louise Boucher was already involved in the Whitney Studio Club in New York, and so that was an important, perhaps, meeting that took place. And so he made a living and then really practiced his new vocation through working with this decorating firm. And this is a reproduction of one of his murals that he would have done in a private home. And this was reproduced in Home and Field. And in it you can see neoclassical influences that perhaps harken back to his father, and then other marine motifs. So when he was in New York, he became very involved with the Whitney Studio Club, which in 1930, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney would turn into the Whitney Museum of American Art. And Howard had his first solo exhibition in 1926 at the Whitney Studio Club. And this is an example of work that he was making around that time and that perhaps was in that exhibition. So this is his first sort of stylistic mode, which is these satirical drawings. And of course, he's thinking about traditional motifs, reclining nude, and then you have this perhaps bath. But then again, there's an allusion to a sort of exterior space in the background. He also briefly shared a studio with the artist Alexander Calder, who was a lifelong friend of his in 1926, before Calder then moved to Paris. And this was one of the really exciting discoveries I was able to make in doing research for this exhibition. This is a painting that Alexander Calder made. He was not a painter, really. He was a sculptor. And early in his career, and it's called A Fireman's Dinner for Brancusi. And so this is in the Whitney's collection, and it's essentially a document, a painting that he made after attending a dinner that was celebrating Constantine Brancusi's third solo exhibition in New York at the Brummer Galleries. And lo and behold, in the center of the composition, you have Robert and Charles Howard swinging around the fireman's pole. So this really puts him in this milieu in an important way, he and his brother both. And they were known for their sort of bald heads, but also known to be very outgoing and gregarious and funny. And so I think you see Brancusi in the center with the back facing us in this sort of Russian Cossack hat. And then Louise Boucher is orating at the table, and then Calder himself is dancing on the tables in the background. And then the rest of the members are also members of the Whitney Studio Club. So in 1928, I think I'm going to have to speed up a little bit here. But in 1928, Howard had an exhibition that his mother helped to organize at the Gallery Beaux-Arts here in San Francisco, which was one of the first modern art galleries on the West Coast, which was founded by Beatrice Ryan. And so the three Howard brothers were featured in this exhibition, and this is a drawing that Howard made to commemorate that show. And here you have Robert Howard, Langley Howard, and Charles Howard sort of ironically relaxing in a luncheon on the grass kind of genre painting. But perhaps it's also thinking about Marcel Duchamp's famous painting of his artist siblings playing chess in a lush setting. And so this is an example of one of his earliest styles. And here you get a sense of him really working through neoclassicism and cubism. So working more and more towards abstraction, but not quite there yet. And you see, again, this neoclassical architectural influence that perhaps refers back to his father. Throughout the early 20th century, from about 1901 to 1918 or thereabouts, Howard and his family spent their summers in Carmel by the sea, and they had a little cabin there. And Jeanette Howard, Charles's sister, recalls them walking along the beach, spending hours walking along the beach and walking to Point Lobos and looking at all the fishermen who lived in the rocks and were fishing. So you see these kinds of beach motifs that pop up in a lot of his paintings as well. And this rock reminds me a lot of Point Lobos. But then again, he's doing something else, and that's like extending traditional motifs, or pushing traditional motifs in a new abstract vein. So on the left of the composition, you see this seashell with this sort of net strewn about, and then this curving form that's emerging from the seashell, which very much recalls the birth of Venus that painters like Botticelli would have done much earlier in the Cinquecento or Quattrocento. And then here you can see in 32, he's still working figuratively, but then there's this mysterious element that enters the composition, and I would say that that's a consistent thread throughout much of his work. And here you have a still life that's sort of oddly placed in the center of this alleyway with this beautiful pastel palette and showing a seascape behind. And then here is sort of his first examples of really experimenting with abstraction and surrealism. So in 1932, as I mentioned, he was included in Julian Livi's surrealism exhibition, and most likely it would have been drawings like this that were included. I think there were about 2 drawings in that exhibition. And here, again, there's sort of a nonsensical event that is transpiring that one would associate with surrealists. To me, it looks like a kind of masked bandit that's sort of smashing through a pane of glass and carrying in tow some strange objects, a plant, a very small chemise. So again, this sense of mystery and enigma, I think, permeates his work. And then, as Howard once said, all of his works are closely related. They are all, in fact, portraits of the same general subject, of the same idea, carried as far as I am able at the time. So, for me, as someone coming to this work without knowing what that subject is, and I immediately, of course, want to figure out what that subject is. And what I think that I was able to determine was that there were 3 central elements that were his subject. One is the creation of balance. You saw this in Banner, which I showed you before, where there was this flag precariously hovering in space, perhaps on the brink of collapse. And 2, which we already alluded to, a synthesis of oppositional forces or states, whether that's abstraction and surrealism, organic and the man-made, and order and chaos. So he's constantly toggling back and forth between these opposing states. And then finally, a moment of transformation that takes place within the landscape. And that's sort of what you see here in this painting excavation, where there's this strange hole in the landscape, perhaps a beach setting. Again, these curious pennants that sort of add a sense of dynamism to the composition. and this sort of construction site. So something's in process, something's in transformation here. And I think that you see those elements in all of his work. In 1933, Howard married the artist Madge Knight, and this is a painting of one of her works. And you can see there are similar concerns and themes that they are both exploring, yet her work is very distinct, I would say, and lovely. She often works in a small scale as well. Madge and Charles moved to London, which is where Madge Knight was from. So in 1933, they leave New York and move to London. And it was then that Charles became very quickly involved with another pivotal group of modernism, which was the Unit 1 group. And here you see him executing a mural by the English modernist Edward Wadsworth. And so Howard was hired to paint this design by Wadsworth for the Delaware Pavilion in Sussex, England in 1935. So this picture was an important picture because it places him within a specific milieu again. And other artists that were in Unit 1, although Howard himself wasn't necessarily a member of the group, other artists were Paul Nash, Henry Moore, and Barbara Hepworth. And they would sort of quickly dissolve and then essentially be turned into or get assumed into abstract and surrealist movements. So in the 30s, we really see Howard wrestling with abstraction and figuration and surrealism. And he does a series of beautiful abstract watercolors, which are in the gallery. Here's one here. But again, you see this sense of a hovering form that's sort of balancing in space. And so even though he wrote that for a period, during this period, he felt, and of course there's in 1935 in Europe, Hitler comes to power in 1933, and so there's an anxiety that's sort of fomenting, I think. And so for him, he said that it was important for him to assert a sense of order within his compositions, and so he became what he called an abstractionist. But then very quickly, he goes back to surrealism. And as I said, in 1936, he was included in the International Surrealist Exposition, which was a very important event in London. It was organized by Roland Penrose and André Breton and Herbert Reed, and over 1,200 people came to see the exhibition in the first day, and it got a lot of publicity. So this was a really important exhibition for him to have been involved with, and out of 54 artists in the exhibition, he was one of 3 Americans, the other 2 being Man Ray and Calder. So it gives you a sense of who he was really showing with at the time. And I think in this painting, he's really hamming up the sort of surrealist style, and you see these biomorphic sort of liquid forms, fragmented shapes, this finger that's tossing an acorn in the front, and then these dripping eyes of this form that's sort of creating a torso-like figure. And then again, you see this shovel and this kind of hole in the landscape, this sort of excavation. In this painting, I think you see a relationship between, I think it's a reference to Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth, who were, of course, sculptors who were first known to pierce the stone through their sculptures. And so you see this little hole inside this fragmented torso. And then his paintings and work becomes much more abstract and somewhat indecipherable in terms of the objects that he's painting. This is a work called Hare Corner from 1939, and it's in the Whitney's collection. And to me, it really shows the influence of Giorgio de Chirico, who was an Italian painter and who was, of course, revered by the Surrealists, and André Breton singled him out for creating these incredible enigmatic dreamscapes. And in these two works, you see in this work, you see this colonnade that's stretching off into the distance, and this tower, and then this reclining female figure. It's called Souvenir of Italy. And then you see elements of this repeating in Howard's work, where you see the arcade and then this, perhaps a hair, stretching off into the distance, sort of mimicking the effect of the shadows. And then you see this intimation of the tower as well. And then, of course, something is sort of precariously hovering in space, whether that's a sign or it also looks like an axe. Then we really sort of lose any reference to objects. This is a work called The Cage, which is from the Guggenheim's collection. And in the 40s, Howard was showing with a dealer named Karl Nierendorf, who, when he died, his collection was given to the Guggenheim Museum, and that collection formed a really strong basis of the Guggenheim's collection. So here again, you have him working with Nierendorf, who then sort of set the tone for modernism, especially at the Guggenheim. And in this painting, you see Howard's predilection for tripartite compositions, which he referred to as his Trinity compositions. And I think this one also recalls aspects of Picasso. Think of his three dancers or three musicians. And these figures sort of assume perhaps an animal-like form. This work is in fact called Trinity, and it's in the Art Institute of Chicago's collection, and it won a purchase prize at the Art Institute of Chicago in the 40s, and thus entered the collection. But you can see a kind of perhaps airplane hovering above, and then you also see this sort of aperture that appears in these compositions. So the brown form in the center also sort of works as perhaps a hole in this interior space that references a skyline or a horizon line. And you'll see this over and over again. This is perhaps one of the paintings that perhaps best displays Howard's anxiety about the impending war. It was done in 1939. It's called The Dove. And Howard said that all of his titles were supplementary and elusive. So not necessarily descriptive, but that the titles would enhance the paintings in a certain sense. But in this painting, you do see a form with these two squat-like legs that perhaps resembles a dove. And then he's crossing this white wooden bridge that's separated by two shores. And so for me, this painting is really about like safe passage to a distant shore. And in 1939, when he made this, many of the modernist artists, surrealists, were leaving Europe and fleeing to the United States. So I think that this is a really key painting that emblematizes that time and period. I think there are also echoes of Giorgione again in this painting, seen in the sort of sfumato background, but also in his Tempest painting, which is in the Accademia in Venice. You see this wooden plank bridge that sort of connects two different banks. And then you see this flash of lightning in the background, which I think is evoked by these crisscrossing lines. So I think there are sort of echoes of Giorgione that he thinks about in his work. So in 1940, Charles Howard and Madge Knight moved back to the Bay Area, and they take an apartment at 91 Water Street, which was very close to his brother Robert Howard and his wife Adeline Kent, where they had their studios and with whom they were very close. This painting was begun in London and then completed in San Francisco. And upon its completion, it was immediately shown at the San Francisco Museum of Art, which is now known as SF MoMA. And it was shown in their annual, and it won a purchase prize for that year. And so then it entered SF MoMA's collection. And this, I think, was an important painting in establishing Charles Howard's reputation in the Bay Area in the 40s. And again, the title is First War Winter, so there is a kind of violence that I think that is latent in this, but yet, of course, everything is very controlled. In the bottom left corner, it might be too dark for you to see in this image, but there is a kind of praying mantis-like form, and then as well in the left, bottom left, and then also on the right. And then in the center, you see this blue shape, which I think also recalls Picasso's Bathers, which were done in this very similar palette of blue. And in the 20s, he did these beach scenes of women, and they had heads of praying mantises. So this sort of frontal view of the praying mantis with the eyes dripping, again, sort of alludes to that. And of course, the praying mantis is known, the female is known to devour the male after intercourse. So there is a kind of violence, I think, that underpins this painting. But yet so beautifully balanced at the same time. So in the 40s, while living in San Francisco, Howard also became involved with the WPA and became designing supervisor of the art section for the Works Progress Administration. And these posters are posters he made for the Oakland Defense Council that advertised rolling blackouts or gas leaks that would be taking place. But again, he takes this kind of enigmatic approach to this theme, I think. This is a painting. Again, you see this sort of aperture or keyhole that emerges on the right, and then this sort of red, luscious, amoebic form in the center. During the 40s, he also was a ship fitter and worked at the Marin shipyards, working to build Liberty ships. And so I think you see a ship theme and ship motifs that reappear in his work. And I think of this as kind of perhaps the interior of a ship, and then you have the porthole that's looking out onto sea. And again, these sort of mysterious radio lines or hairs that are dangling in space. And this painting was shown at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and again won 5th place in the Artists for Victory exhibition, which was an exhibition that was a very patriotic event during the war. The Met uncustomarily gave over its galleries to an artist collective, Artists for Victory, Inc., and there were hundreds of works that were included in this exhibition, and Howard won the 5th purchase prize in that exhibition, and then this painting entered the Met's collection. So there was a lot of interesting historical information to uncover in terms of the history, exhibition history, and the history of modernism as well. And then this is a sort of similar work, but you can see he's taking it to a more abstract extreme. Again, you have this red form in the center of the composition, and then this kind of aperture that is showing a vista onto a horizon. In 1941, and I think I only have 5 minutes left, but is that correct? Yeah, okay. He befriended the curator and writer Douglas McKay, who moved to San Francisco with his wife, Germaine McKay, and Germaine would go on to curate his retrospective at the Legion of Honor in 1946, and then Douglas McKay would become a ardent supporter of Howard's work and would write numerous essays on Howard's work. For a period in 1944, Douglas McKay suffered from tuberculosis for most of his life. And for a period of 54 days, he entered a sanatorium in San Jose while he was recovering. And during that period, Charles Howard made a drawing per day and sent it to Douglas McKay. This is the first one. So he signed and dated each one of them. And it says, "To the absent friend." And I think this body of work really gives you a sense of his friendship, but also his great care and concern for his friends and then also his family. And so here's another drawing from that series. And this is probably Charles eating. Again, the bald head is a bit of a giveaway. But it's done from the perspective of perhaps inside of his head. And another interesting fact about this series of drawings is that in 2005, the well-known artist Robert Gober presented these drawings in his exhibition that he curated at the Menil collection. These drawings are in the Menil's collection. Called The Meat Wagon, and it was drawn, and it was really about Dominique and John de Menil's life. And then he also included them in his Schaulager retrospective a couple of years later. So these are perhaps the most well-known works in the exhibition, but I think they're really incredible drawings. Here's a sort of dripping nose, so the themes of health and sanitation are recurring. Here's perhaps the blood on a handkerchief. And then McKay was known as a writer, and he had these black-rimmed glasses. And so you see elements of his character appearing in these drawings. And then McKay was taking an experimental drug at that time called streptomycin, which fortunately worked. And now not so experimental, and so he was cured. And then this is the last drawing in the series, "To the Friend Returned." So I think, so we showed 20 out of 54 of these drawings in the exhibition. Okay, maybe I'll just wrap up with this last work, even though I have more to show. So I mentioned Douglas McKay, and the title of the exhibition, the subtitle, "A Margin of Chaos," comes from an essay that McKay wrote in 1946 that really outlines McKay's belief in the sense of an organized or controlled sense of chaos that is in Howard's paintings. And in the essay, he wrote, "A fleeting occasion of suspense, a time when one is on the verge of witnessing a cosmic change." That's sort of what he saw in the paintings. And for McKay, I think it's these moments of an epic metamorphosis, or this sort of suspended zone that he calls as the margin of chaos, that Howard captures in his work. So I think that's a really key element to highlight. But then I think in making it the title of the exhibition, I was also playing with this notion of margins and historical margins, and these sort of the unreadable or unknown margins that have to be recovered and excavated. So I think I will leave it there, even though I have more slides to show, because I do want to leave time for questions. Are there any questions? Oh, and it looks like there's a microphone,
Okay.
so you should wait for the microphone to arrive before you ask.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Apsara. I'm going to just start out by asking a couple questions. We've been talking about exhibition making, and I so appreciated your research phase and production phase slides at the beginning. And so I'm speaking from that the exhibition making perspective. Can you address that sort of precarious moment between the two, the fundraising moment and moments where you may have done an extraordinary amount of research, but maybe couldn't get into the production phase, and what happens then, so the students can understand?
Well, in this case, I think that in terms of fundraising, it's very challenging to raise money for an artist that most people have not heard of. So most people want to fund, the Salvador Dali exhibitions or the very well-known artists. So there is a sort of, intense period where you don't know if you're going to get the money to do the exhibition. And in our case, we kind of forged ahead, hoping that it would come through in the end. But, and luckily it did. But there are instances in preparing an exhibition, and I have had it happen several times, where you do that sort of preliminary phase of research, and then you aren't able to secure a substantial portion of the funds, and then there is a difficult decision of, do you continue and hope that it arrives, or do you cancel the project? So it is a kind of delicate balance that you just have to work through it.
And just one more question, which is, if you could talk a little bit more about Douglas McKay, because he is such a significant figure in San Francisco history, and your symposium that Saturday the 19th? There will be a symposium on Charles Howard, and if you could sort of talk about who's speaking.
Yeah, so Douglas McKay, I didn't really have time to get into this, but it was a really fascinating Bay Area persona figure, as was his wife, Germaine McKay, and they were really at the center of the art scene in the Bay Area in the 40s. Grace McCann Morley, who was the director of the San Francisco Museum of Art, had hired Douglas McKay to be a curator there in 1941, and then Germaine McKay was hired at the Legion of Honor. So they were both curating and producing really interesting exhibitions during the 40s. And in 45, just after he recovered, he actually became the president of the California School of Arts, which is now SFAI, and was really key in bringing abstract expressionists such as Mark Rothko and Clifford Still to teach at SFAI. And that was really important in the sense that it brought abstract expressionism to the Bay Area. And, Charles Howard leaves in 1946 and returns to England. So had he stayed, he would have taught most likely at SFAI, where his brother Robert Howard was already teaching, and he had founded the sculpture department there. So really the entire family the Howard family was really embedded in Bay Area modernism, and then they were known as the first family of Bay Area modernism. And then McKay leaves in 1950 and moves to Texas. And his wife, Germaine McKay, becomes the director of the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston. And then becomes a personal advisor to Dominique de Menil, and helps found the art history department at St. Thomas. And it was through her, she bequeathed this painting and the drawings and another painting to the Menil collection. So it's thanks to her that they have those Charles Howards. And then by this time, Douglas and Germaine had separated, but Douglas was also in Texas, and then he went on to do many other things. He was really an extraordinary person, but really a key figure in Bay Area modernism in the 40s. Yeah, the SFAI is the San Francisco Art Institute, and it was known in the 40s as the California School of Fine Arts.
I've just been noticing on so many, there's a luminous quality behind, and I wonder if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. A couple other people have written about, actually Douglas Dryspoon, who has written one of the few other essays on Charles Howard's work, really picks up on this theme, and his essay is called The Drama of the Mind. So it is a kind of dramatic stage set that he is also creating, that's like beautifully backlit, which throws these strange forms into relief in the center of the composition often. And then that was actually drama of the mind, I think, was a phrase that McKay also wrote about Howard's work. So people have definitely picked up on that and written about that. So I think it's very apparent in the pieces. But also the sense of balance. And I know I mentioned that a little bit, but here you really have that theme become much more pronounced in this work, where you have this balancing pole in the center of the composition, and it's linking these two other sides, perhaps like the dove, these two different shores. So the theme of balance and theatrical sort of stage sets, I think, is very present.
Hi, thank you. That was fascinating, and I enjoyed the exhibition when I went to visit. So it seems like you found a great subject for an exhibition, right? So particularly at BAMPFA, right? So he's very wired into the Berkeley world and the Bay Area. BAMPFA is what I meant. Thank you. So how do you go about choosing, subjects for an exhibition? What are your thoughts? Mm-hmm. And then once you've decided there's something you're interested in doing, mm-hmm. I wonder if you could talk about how you convince other people that it's something that's worth doing.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, here at Berkeley, we are real champions of the under-recognized. So I think there was a lot of passion, both on my director's side and my side, to really explore these artists who aren't really well known today. And there's really rich story and history there to uncover. And so one of the really exciting aspects for me was to be able to tell that story, which was, there's so many different historical elements that get covered in his life. And, when you're embarking on the initial research, you have no idea the extent of it. But also one of the challenging things was for me to see if there was enough work out there that was existing to really develop an exhibition. So that's sort of that preliminary phase where you have to go through and see, is there an exhibition here? And in this case, there was a lot more material than I expected to find. And then I spent several weeks reading through John Galen Howard's papers and the family's papers in the Bancroft, which is just fascinating. And it really sort of tells a history of American just cultural history in general, in addition to art history. And so that was really fun to sort of get into too. So there was a lot of rich history to sort of link together through the process of this exhibition.
Was there a period during which you had to persuade other people that it was a recent topic as well?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have to do that so much because I had the support of the director. But in terms of fundraising, definitely. And then, getting the museum on board with it as well, and, our board of trustees and all that. So there are definitely many presentations that are done throughout the process.
I think there's a question here. If you have a question, raise your hand and the microphone.
Okay, so I got the idea with the first photo you showed of that old Italian painting, mentioning it is a Renaissance painting. I knew that in Renaissance it was really important to have the symmetry, and so it went through the altar where the lady was sitting with a baby on her arm, and even the floor, the tiles had the completely symmetry. And I forgot to follow that idea in the beginning of the photos you're showing of Charles Howard, but now I see in the background there's always a pole of a plant-like or whatever. So it seems to be important, but he's not following this to the foreground. So
Yeah, or he's playing with it as
okay.
well. But I think that these sort of elements that you find in Giorgione or neoclassicism as well, such as symmetry, are something that he's constantly thinking about through his work, but he's thinking of how to reinterpret these ideas perhaps in a modern way. So I think those themes really carry throughout a lot of the work.
Yes, you mentioned that in one of the factors in the preparation was to see the artist's estate.
To meet with them, yeah.
Yes, to
Yeah.
meet with them. So I'm wondering, does this mean you never work with living artists?
Oh no, I work with living artists a lot. So one of the things that I do is I oversee the Matrix exhibition series here, which is all exhibitions with living artists. This is actually the first exhibition I did that was historical. So in the sense, that was also interesting, and in the sense that I got to really delve into the artist's work and attempt to interpret what he was trying to say and what he was doing. And in doing so, you always want to talk to the estate, the people who knew him, his family, and really understand his working methods, and be true to those methods and the artist's work to the best of your ability. But it's a challenging prospect too, in that the artist isn't there to ask anymore. So it's more like detective work in a sense.
So 2 parts. One, Apsara, since you said that there wasn't that much writing about Howard, some curators are in a situation where there's a lot of writing and you use that to translate into an exhibition. In some cases, it seemed like you were really writing history, that you were becoming the historian. I wonder if there were certain moments where you felt that responsibility more than others.
Yeah,
and then I'll just say a second is when and if we go down and continue to go down, are there things about how you did the floor plan that you'd like us to think about as you told the story?
So the first question was about writing the history. So that was something that I was sort of intimidated by in the beginning because there wasn't that much known about the artist. But then once you start really digging into the material and the research, and you're very methodical about it. You're checking all the records for Ellis Island to double check the dates of when he actually departed and arrived to the U.S. Because in certain sense, some of the history that had been written was wrong. And so you really have to be rigorous in your research and double check all dates and everything to make sure that you're doing a thorough job in this. But that opportunity to be able to write the history of this artist was really thrilling and rewarding for me. So that was one of the things I enjoyed most about working on this project, I would say. And then also getting to know, his incredible work throughout the process. But in terms of the installation, again, you're thinking about how to tell his story. The layout really follows a kind of chronological order, and then there are wall texts that sort of describe each of the key sort of biographical moments of his career. But then within that, I gave myself permission to break the chronology too when necessary. So in the second gallery, I sort of begin with the first war-winter painting that I showed, which was done from 1939 to 40. But in the previous gallery, I had shown a few paintings that were from the later 40s. So you're not necessarily strict in doing this sort of chronological layout. You want to make it look really good and draw resonances and themes between the paintings as well, or gouaches or watercolors. So it's sort of a balance, I would say, of those things. Yeah.
We haven't had any students ask questions yet, so I would like to encourage, without forcing, if there are any student questions.
Thank you for sharing Howard's stories with us. So you mentioned in the preliminary research phase that it's important to see as much works as possible. So I was wondering, as a curator, what kind of information are you looking into when you see the original work?
Yeah, that's a good question. Really, at that point, I'm just trying to see as much as I can to start to understand the work. Visiting, and I think with his work, the photographs really don't convey the sense of presence that you experience within the compositions, especially the sense of the complex sense of space that he develops in his composition. So it is really important to see the work in person, because you always notice things that you won't notice in the photographs. And in certain cases, the photographs that were existing, the color was all wrong, and so you don't really know, what the palette is that he's using if you're relying too heavily on photographs. But yeah, I guess you're really just looking for the key work, in addition to getting an overall sense of the work. You're looking for works that really stand out amongst other works, and so you really want to show the best work in this exhibition, or an exhibition. So that is really informative in that sense. Okay.
I'll just say, Apsara clearly chose the best work. It's an incredible exhibition. I hope that you'll continue to see it before it goes down. Thank you for the contribution to history, to exercising your curatorial authority, and thank you for all of your incredible time with us today.
Thank you very much.
And students sign attendance sheets on the way out if you haven't.